Alright, welcome to part 3. This is how we left off last time. As you can see, the render is looking okay, but I think we obviously need a lot more particles, so we're just going to start with that. Go back to our object level. I'm going to go back to my scene view. I'm going to turn off these render geometries for now and jump into my work area. And this grid we don't really need anymore. I'm just going to delete it. And in order to increase the amount of particles, it's pretty simple. We're going to go into our scatter where we create our particles. And we're gonna put this to maybe times 25 or something. This should give us a lot more particles. Let's see, so times 4, I'm gonna control shift left click to break it so it doesn't have the multiplier anymore. And I'm gonna, let's see how many particles we have now actually before we do this. So the very last frame we have 356,000 particles. We can definitely go into a few million, so if we multiplied this by say 5, we would have between 1.5 and 2 million particles, which I think will be fine. Let's try this. So I'm gonna mark this version 2 now, so we can go back to our version 1, and I'm gonna save to disk. And this might take a few minutes. Definitely will take a few minutes depending on your computer, and because it's gonna be pretty fast in the beginning, and then it's gonna slow down as it accumulates more and more particles. So I'll come back when this finishes. So that only took around 3-4 minutes, not too bad. And now, as you can see, we have a lot more particles and end up with 17 or 1.7 million particles, which is a decent number. We can definitely go higher. In some of the videos I've done earlier, I've been up in almost 10 million particles for some of the longer ones, because obviously the longer the scene, the more particles will accumulate. This is not too long. This is about 5 seconds, so not too bad. And if we go visualize our sprites, we can see now that it's a lot more dense because we kept the same particle scale. We haven't changed that yet. So if we go between the versions, you can go here and type version 1. You can see that it's the same scale for each particle. There's just a lot more of them now. So what we want to do to kind of counteract this is we want to put our particle scale maybe to multiply it by 0.7-ish. That should be, we can try 0.6. I think that should be better. We can go into our camera and go into our render view. So frame 75, I'm gonna go to the same one and save it, and then do a progressive render and see what this gives us. And now it just should be more detailed. You should see a bit more form. It'll just look a bit more natural now that you don't see a bunch of tiny points, and they'll be even tinier, which will be better. So let's see, and it'll take a little bit longer to start up the render now as well, because there's more geometry for it to fetch and to kind of initialize, but not too bad still. And here we are. I'm gonna focus on this area by just holding my mouse down on it, and yeah, it's a lot more dense, which is nice. There's more detail in here. This will look a lot better obviously when it's fully rendered, but it's already starting to look a lot better. And I think since this didn't really take that long, I think we're actually going to go even higher. You can stop here, you can go even lower if you want, or come in a higher particle amount with me, like I will do in a second. Again, all depending on how much time you want to spend on the cache and the render eventually. But for now, I think this is looking nice. But let's try going back to our scene view, and on the scatter now, I'm actually gonna again control shift click just so we break the multiplication so it doesn't turn blue, and we're going to multiply this by 4. I think that should be our final number, which will end up with maybe a bit over 5 million particles. So I'm just going to overwrite the cache that I have now, and I'm gonna come back once this finishes. Alright, the cache just finished, and it took around 10-12 minutes, which is not that bad really. And as you can see, we have a lot more particles now. We can also kind of see a lot more apparent now that we have this stepping that I talked about before, but from our camera angle, and we're going to add some motion blur and stuff, I don't think it'll be too visible. But obviously it just looks like a bunch of white point. I mean, it just looks like one big mesh almost. But we're going to go to our sprites to actually see some shapes, and this will take a bit, it wasn't actually that bad. We can easily visualize this now, and I'm going to lower the P-scale again to get some nicer shapes in here. I'm gonna put it to 0.3, see where that gets us. Maybe that's a bit much. 0.4. We'll have to render it to really see what it's gonna look like. I'm gonna go back to 0.3 and kick off a render and see what that gives us. So again, I'm gonna save this, and I'm gonna shift drag just the area around our character, because then what I'll do is it'll only render in here and ignore the points around. Well, we don't have anything around because we don't want to keep re-rendering our environment, because that's taking up a significant amount of the time that goes into this render. So now it's going to be even faster just rendering this area. And if we compare it to our last version, well, let's go back to frame 75. So we have an even number, and you can probably hear my computer ramping up now, the fan speed, because it does obviously use a lot of CPU power to render this. And yeah, it's a bit hard to see now that it's still as noisy as it is now, but it's the longer we render. I'm going to turn this off just to get a full res render. And as you can see now, it's looking a lot better, especially if you compare. I'm going to delete this one in the middle. If you compare it to the very first one, it's got a lot more shape now and looks a lot nicer, which is exactly what we want. It might even be too sparse now. We might actually go a little bit higher in the P scale. I kind of like it when it's pretty dense, so I'm gonna save this and put my P scale to 0.4 or multiply it by 0.4, and let's see where this gets us. It's just gonna update the render. You don't need to do anything. As you can see, it's already more dense and it's looking nice. You see a lot of shape now. These particles that are trailing behind are also looking nice. And yeah, I think this will be a good starting point. Well, we're almost done. It's not a starting point anymore. So another thing we're going to do in order to enhance this is we're going to make the particles as they fall off become smaller, because we want to see the shape a lot more than we want to necessarily see the particles behind them. So I'm going to stop this render, and the way we can do this is we can use the age attribute that we created before, and we can tell it that when it's just born, so when it just got into the simulation, it'll have the full particle scale that we're setting it here. But as it ages and as it kind of falls down, it's going to turn into a bit smaller particles, because then we'll kind of see this is the main form, and then the other ones will just trail off. And we're going to do this by modifying the P scale again. So type at P scale, at P scale times equal to, we can try times equal to at age. And what that'll do is it'll just, so the age starts counting from 0 to 1. So you can see that the ones that are just born are now invisible because they're multiplying the P scale by 0, and then it's gonna get closer and closer to 1, which is 1 second. So around here maybe reaches 1 second, and it's all gonna be normal from there. Actually, these ones go even bigger because it goes beyond 1 second. But we want to kind of reverse that. We want it to be strong and then go weaker and weaker, and we can do that with a fit. So we're gonna fit our H between a value of 0 and let's say 1, and we're going to fit it from, instead of going from 0 to 1, we're going to go from 1 to 0, so that it goes from big to small instead of small to big. And now you can see it starts out normal size and then it goes smaller and smaller, but we don't want it to completely disappear. We want it to still stay at somewhat of a high P scale. So instead of from 1 to 0, we're going to go from 1 to 0.6 maybe, and it's not super apparent now, but if we turn this off or go back to 1 to 1, which would just be normal, you can see that it's definitely doing something. It's making them smaller as they fade off. And instead of taking 1 second to fade off, I'm going to take 0.5 so that it fades off even sooner. And I'm going to set this to, yeah, 0.6 I think is fine. Maybe let's try 0.5, and also up the particle scale a little bit, 0.45 in general, so that it'll be a nicer shape. And let's see where this gets us. I'm going to save this one, hit render, and just come back when this finishes. Okay, so this is how our render ended up, and as you can see now, these particles behind here are smaller. They're not as visible, but we still get a nice shape, but the main focus will be on the character itself. And I actually remember one thing that I completely forgot to do, which will affect the sim, or the look of the sim, a lot, and that is to have some initial velocity when these particles are being sourced into the simulation. So what I'm going to do is on my scatter, I'm going to multiply this. I'm going to, again, Control-Shift break it, just so we can remember this number. I'm going to multiply it by 0.05, just so I can work with it. So we're back to 4,000. I'm actually 0.02. So now I have, like, it's going to be very fast to simulate, but so we can easily iterate and do another test. And I'm going to go into my pop simulation and just play it real quick so we can have something to compare against. So this is what it looks like now. And it looks fine, but what we can do is, you can see how he moves his whole body and his arms. It has movement, and if we take that movement and we apply it to the initial kind of speed of these particles, we'll see them kind of fall off with them. Instead of falling straight down, they'll even more follow his movement. And we can do that by computing the velocity of the geometry. So on our geometry convert here, right between the scatter and these two, we're going to put a node called trail. What trail will do is, let's see, it ended up here for some reason. It'll remember where this character was in the last position. So you can see if I put the trail length higher, it'll kind of just create the trail of the character. But we don't want this, of course. We just want to use the compute velocity part of this node. So if I click here to visualize my velocity, you can see we can see where this guy is going, and like we're creating velocities for the arms and for the whole body, and we can apply this to our particles. So now that we have this velocity, I'm going to just plug it in here. This will carry through the scatter, and it should actually automatically be sourced in. And it looks like on our very first frame we have really high velocity in the wrong direction, and I think that's because on frame 0 he starts all the way over there. So a quick way to fix this would just be to we can just animate the velocity scale. So this controls how much of the velocity or what it will be multiplied with, and I'm gonna just put it to 0, alt left mouse to set a keyframe, and go to our first frame and set it to 1, so that we don't have anything on the first frame. And then I think on our last frame we should be good. Yeah, we're stopping the sourcing as it goes back, so we should be okay. So let's try this, and as you can see on here, there's on the attributes it's already using the inherited velocity, so it should work by default. And yeah, as you can see now, he kind of flings all the particles with them, which is a lot better, but this is too much. We don't want it to completely go that far. And I think, actually, I don't like how the first frame just drops. So a way to fix this is, instead of, I'm going to break the control shift break this velocity scale so it's always at 1, but I'm going to put this velocity approximation to forward difference so that it computes this forwardly, so it doesn't look backwards, it looks forward instead, which will fix it. But what will happen, I'll actually break it on our last frame. So I'm just going to keyframe this one and then go forward 1 frame and then set it to backward difference and alt click to keyframe it, and that'll fix it. It's a bit of an annoying thing to do to fix it, but it works. And now you can see our simulation should, yeah, there we go. Now it's working a lot better. But I think a value of 1 is too much. Let's do maybe half. That's looking better, because now we can kind of feel the forward movement, but it won't overtake him. Let's do 0.4. That's our final number. And let's try simulating this with our full amount of particles. So I'll be back in 10 minutes. I'm actually gonna keep this cache and do a new one and save the disk and see where this gets us. Alright, another 10 minutes has passed, and this is what we're left with now. It might look the same just like this, but if we compare it to the previous version, you can see it's all progressing along with the character, which is really nice. And then it also fixes these stepping issues we're having, at least for the most part. So that's really nice, and in motion this will look a lot better. So I'm pretty happy with this. Let's do a test render, and then I think we should almost be ready to finalize this and send off our overnight render. Well, if you want to render this whole thing. So I'm going to hit render on frame 75, and it'll look a bit differently now. It's a bit hard to say on 1 frame, like if it's going to be better or worse just from that 1 frame, but in motion this will help us a lot. Okay, so the render has started, and yeah, you can see we lose some of this back here because it's obviously being flung forward now, but I think that's okay. And I might adjust the particle scale for these ones behind here. Let's go into our attribute triangle. Let's see, I think we can put this to 0.6 just so it's not, doesn't lose too much volume back here. And I think that'll be nice. And then let's actually jump into this middle one just for the color and desaturate it a little bit, just so it gets a bit more like sandish colors. Then let's see where that gives us. It takes a little bit to update these now, but I'm just gonna let this one finish, see where we're at. Let's compare it So this is what we had before, and the shape now is as well, like we're not seeing these sharp edges, it's more of a general looking form, which I think is nicer. It's not as defined, it's still defined, but you don't see every single detail of the character, which we don't want it to be a bit ominous. So I think this is nice. And yeah, so we've come a long way from here to here now. Looking a lot better. So let's send this, well, let's actually set it up for a final render before we do that. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna go into our outnet, onto our mantra, and this noise level tab here really controls how long a render will take. I'm gonna save this one and put this to 0.03. It kind of decides how much noise is like allowable in the render, and as you can see, it's already going a lot faster. And it does introduce a little bit of noise into the background, but it won't be too noticeable with everything when it's playing at full frame. And I'm gonna just shift click just outside so that I can render the whole thing. And this should be a lot quicker, because I think this took around 3 minutes before, and now you can see it's running through this really quickly. And this noise, we can use the denoiser afterwards. We can kind of have other ways to fix this, but I think it'll be okay. So this looks nice. I might also, on the background here, increase the subdivision on this, so that, because we can see a little bit of edges here. I'm gonna go into my object area on the ground, and I'm gonna set this to 3 in the depth, because you'll see that this kind of smoothens out this whole part. Not too big of a difference, but a slight one. And I think this is nice. You can see a little bit of black up here. Let's actually fix that. You know, I think I might actually reposition the camera a little bit. I think we want to be a little bit closer to this character so we see more of him and less of the background. So I'm just gonna cancel this render by pressing escape. I'm gonna go out here into my camera and visualize the Sandmonster. I'm gonna go to one of the final frames, right here, and I'm gonna go ahead and move the camera down a little bit so that we can go forward. Sorry, oh, I'm not in my camera. Okay, now I'm in my camera. I'm gonna move it down a little bit and then forward a little bit and Z, and then a little bit in the X as well, just so we can be nicer and closer to this character. I think this is cool. Let's render this whole frame again, and it shouldn't take too long. And the final step that we should do after this is adding some motion blur to the particles, because the camera it'll have its shutter open for a little bit, so you won't see like the points themselves. You'll kind of see streaks of the points. And now we're closer and it's bigger, which is nice. So everything will be a little bit streaky if they're in high motion, and we can simulate this within our renderer by just enabling velocity motion blur. And in one frame it kind of just looks blurry, but in motion again this will look a lot better and it'll be more correct. So I'm gonna do this frame. I'm just rendering this fully frame now, just to have something to compare it against, and then we're gonna enable motion blur, and I'll show you what the difference is, because we already stored, that's the V attribute, the velocity attribute we already stored on our particles. That's gonna be telling the renderer how much motion blur is applied to each particle. So now that we have this, I'm gonna save this. I'm gonna go on my geometry, and under render sampling, set this geometry velocity blur to velocity blur. And you also have to go into your mantra and enable allow motion blur. And this shutter offset will be 1 by default. So let's just keep it at 1. And it'll take a second to initialize this. And you should see that these background ones, it's a little bit noisy, so it's a little bit hard to see because we have a lot of noise in our image right now. I might actually go a little bit higher for the final render, but we should be able to at least see a little bit of difference between these. You can kind of see them falling down, but you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this off. I'm going to select just this area right here, and I'm going to put my pixel samples to 4. So this is just going to tell it to use even more pixel samples, and I'm going to put the noise level to 0.02. So this will be a higher quality render, so we can easily see the difference that it's making. And you know what, I'm actually going to make the particles that fall off even higher, so I'm going to put 0.7, just so we get a bit more shape and we can actually see these and what they're doing. So let's just give this 1 second to render. Again, it shouldn't take too long. Renders can take 10 minutes each. They can take a few minutes. I generally like to keep them under a few minutes so that in an hour or in a night of rendering I can finish whatever I'm trying to render, and this should definitely fall within that limit. So this is our non-motion blurred frame, and I'm gonna save this. I'm gonna allow motion blur, and you can see, you should be able to see this kind of streak downwards a little bit now. These particles back here, yeah, there we go. So they're kind of streaking down, and everything else as well, you can see that it's kind of trailing off, and it'll look a lot more natural. So I think that's good, and I think this render setting, or these render settings, will be good for a final render as well. I'm just gonna let this one finish, and yeah, I think this is looking nice. Okay, so the render finished just for this one frame, and we can see that it takes 1 minute and 18 seconds, which will be around the average for each frame, I would think. And for 130 frames, 1 minute for 60 frames would be an hour. I'm guessing this will take around 2.5 hours, maybe a bit more, which is really not that bad for a full frame render. So I'm gonna see how long it takes with 5 pixel samples. I don't think it should take that much longer, because as long as our noise level is at 0.02, it shouldn't be that bad. And I can already see that I'm not going to let this fully finish, but I'm guessing it'll take a bit longer, so our total render will be maybe 3-4 hours, which is totally fine for overnight. But this will make it a little bit higher res and or a little bit less noise in our render, which is what we want. Obviously, if you want to go even higher, it'll look even more clean, but this will basically do the job for my sake, I think. So we're all good here. One final thing I'm going to do is also put this environment light, the light intensity, I'm going to multiply it by 1.5. I'm going to turn on this progressive render just to make the whole scene a bit brighter in general, because when you're working, you might get used to a darker look, but when you actually make it brighter and compare, you'll see that it looks a lot nicer and a lot more natural when it's brighter. So I think this is looking better. Again, we could of course tweak this in the compositing software afterwards to make it brighter, but get it as close as you can in your render and then go from there. So I'm gonna go with this brighter look, which I think is nicer. 1.6 just for good measures. Alright, there we go. And now let's set up our naming and where we're gonna store these render files. I'm gonna go into images, and on the output picture here, this is where we're going to store it. So it's going to be stored in our hip, which is where we have all our folder. That's the variable with all our folders. In our render folder, which is obviously good. And I'm not going to, hip name is the name of our file, tutorial Sandmonster. I'm going to remove this. I don't want this to be part of our render. I'm just going to use the $OS, which will be which is the name of this mantra. So I'm going to call this Sandmonster render version 1. Just so I can version this up if I ever wanted to update the render. It's going to use the $F variable. The 4 is just so that it says 001 instead of, or 0001 instead of just 1. I can middle mouse and go all the way to show you. So it'll be in the render folder, Sandmonster render v1, which is our name of the node, and then frame 75, and then an EXR as our file. This is just a file that stores every single pixel, and it's just a really high quality file. Whereas the JPEG would compress it. So let's just stick with that. I think that's a good name and location for it. I'm going to set my frame range. So I'm going to click on this valid frame range and set it to render frame range. By default, it'll get the first and the last frame, $F start, $F end, which is our set range. So that's perfect. That's what we want. And I'm just going to save my file, Control S, and I think we are good to send this off for a render. So I'm going to send this off to render by clicking render to disk, and I'll be back in a few hours. So this is the render we ended up with. It took about 3 hours on my computer, and I'm not super happy with it. It looks okay, but I feel like there's a few things that I could change, that wouldn't take too long. It would increase the results by a lot and would make it look better. So I'm going to go ahead and do that since I have the time. And those things are primarily, you can see how it changes color. The color is constantly changing all over the place, and that's because I made a little mistake when I was creating the rest attribute. You kind of have to freeze it one step further, so I'm going to do that. And I also don't really love how it slides on the floor, so I'm just going to make it stick by adding some friction. And I might also adjust the particle scale a slight bit, but they're quick changes, so I'm going to do that and just send off another render. And I'm going to do that by going back into my work area, and it's a quick little fix for this rest position. We have to resim it. It only takes about 10 minutes, so that's okay. But I'm gonna do a time shift, and I'm gonna shift it to frame 1. So it's gonna, the time shift will freeze the position of it. So I'm gonna hide all other objects. So I'm just seeing this. So what it will do, it won't compute all the frames like we usually would. The time shift will take whatever frame you give it here, and it'll just be stuck on that frame. So by default, it's got $F, so $frame, so it'll just give you the frame you're at. But if you Control Shift click on it and then give it a number, it'll freeze it on wherever you want it. And if you put this into the second input of the rest position, it'll always use that first frame as the rest position. And we actually have to do this before the scatter, because the scatter makes it change position. We want to do it on the geometry. So I'm gonna Control X these nodes, which will cut them, but also copy them, and then paste them in and plug these back in here, right under the trail. So we're generating the rest position on our character, it's being scattered, and then it goes into the simulation. And we should be able to just resim this now. Actually, let me as well reduce the friction, so I'm gonna multiply by 0.01 just so I can iterate on it easier. And go back to the start here. I think it's just taking a second because it's loading the previous cache. While it's loading, we can look at it. I think the shadows are fine. We see it defined. It's still a little low res. We're only rendering 1280, so we can't see as many particles as I would like, but that's okay. I might render this 1080p, but I know if you have the non-commercial version of Houdini, you can only render 1280, so maybe I'll just stick with this. But it's looking nice overall. Let's see, I think our... Oh, there we go. So the sim is now working. And yeah, like previously I just kept the friction on at 0 so I could slide around on the floor. But I'm gonna go to my pop object and set the friction to 1. And now it'll stick to the floor instead of sliding, which I think will look a bit better, a bit more natural. So let's give this a shot. I'm gonna go back to, let's see, I'm actually gonna only go to 0.7. I'm not gonna do as many particles. I think since we're not doing full res and not that high res of the render, I think it's better to have a little bit less particles. So we're gonna do 0.7. And I'm also, because of that, I'm gonna change the particle scale a little bit higher to maybe 0.6. I think that will be nice. So I'm just gonna overwrite the cache I have, and I'll be back. I'm actually gonna do the resim it, and then I'm probably gonna re-render it as well and be back after that. And here are the results of this new render, and overall I'm pretty happy with it. I think that making it stick to the ground instead of sliding was a good idea. It makes it look more natural, as well as having the colors stay consistent also helps a lot. So there's a few improvements we could do, maybe in compositing and some other fine-tuning, but in order to not make this video too long, I'm gonna end it here. Maybe we'll address some of those in a later video. If you end up recreating this and posting it online, I would love to see it. I go by EraVFX on all platforms, so please tag me. And yeah, thank you so much for watching this tutorial, and I hope to see you in my next one.